Hi, Dr. J. Franklin Schultz with you with another video that I hope will add some intelligence to the conversation about modern policing, police reform, and even defunding. One of the things that gets pulled out in the debate about modern American policing is, well, y'all started as slave patrols to begin with. Let me tell you why I think that that's irrelevant and a non sequitur, and really ought to be laid aside as part of the debate. That's part of pushing emotions to the surface and saying you guys are still acting like slave chasers of pre-Civil War. Listen, I was a police officer from 1978 until a couple of years ago. I worked with officers who had been cops in the late 50s and through the 60s and 70s, and so I've touched the whole era of many, many years in the history of policing. There's nothing in my DNA, there's nothing in any police officer's DNA that has anything to do with their great, 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 great whatever ancestors who were slave patrols pre-Civil War. First of all, many of those slave patrols were privateers. And we still have some questions about the difference between private and public policing. When we talk about some cases that are called examples of police brutality, they didn't involve police at all until a police response. So we want to be careful about that. They certainly were, many of them were paid by the government, but they didn't have policing duties per se. They were just out there trying to regulate the Black Americans who were either slaved or free, and to keep them under control so that they didn't disrupt the white culture. Absolutely admit that. And there's some elements of that controlling the black population that lasted well into the modern era up until through my lifetime. But to talk about today's policing as having any relationship to slave patrols is disingenuous. First of all, we know that formal policing that was using the British model happened in the 1800s, especially post-Civil War, early 1900s. We started having formal urban police with uniforms and some training and standards and those kind of things. And certainly there were some deep, deep faults about who got hired and what kind of training they had and what responsibilities they had. Those problems have increasingly, year by year, day by day, have had solutions working on them. And we've really made a tremendous amount of progress, and we're so far divorced from the slave patrols that it really is not honest to talk about any comparison between the two other than saying, look how far we've come. But another issue with the slave patrol is that was something that was going on in the South in areas where runaway slaves or escaped slaves was a legal issue prior to the abolition of slavery. So if we're going to say that the Portland police or the Albuquerque police or the Denver police or the Chicago police or the Kansas City police have any relationship to slave patrols, there's just no historical linkage there at all. The other issue or another issue is that you have to understand that pre-Civil War, there was no responsibility of state and local governments to uphold constitutional standards. It wasn't until the passage of the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, which specifically says if there is a constitutional or federally protected right or privilege that is embedded in the Constitution, then every government, state, local, county, whatever, has to protect and abide by those constitutional guidelines. That didn't exist prior to the Civil War. So the laws under which government agents on the non-federal level were operating were different. Not necessarily just, not right, not moral necessarily, but constitutional guidelines were not really an issue. Some states had more restrictive rights and privileges than others. But the point is that it wasn't until the 14th Amendment that those constitutional guidelines were applied to the states. And factually, it didn't really come about until nearly 100 years later. It wasn't until the 1960s during the Warren Court era, when Earl Warren was the Supreme Court Chief Justice, that these cases were brought into the national spotlight and said, yeah, you've got a right to have an attorney. That really wasn't the state of the law until those decisions in the 60s. You have the right to remain silent. That really wasn't the state of the law for local law enforcement until the 1960s. So this evolution happened very, very quickly, and it happened very, very thoroughly. I'm not saying law enforcement is perfect. I'm not saying there's an absence of racism. I'm not saying that the criminal justice system doesn't treat people of color differently. That is a phenomena that deserves a lot of attention. But the transition from slave patrol to modern policing, there's just no linkage left there. The duties of the slave patrol were nothing like the duties of modern policing. There was no general responsibility or expectation that they were going to be accountable to the public and do all the kinds of things that modern policing does today. And a lot's changed since prior to the 1860s. For example, when I go to a barber, I don't expect that they're going to do any dental work or surgery on me. When I go to a dentist, I don't expect that I'm going to get a haircut out of the deal. When I go to a doctor, I don't expect that I'm going to be covered with leeches so the bad blood will be sucked out of my body. So if we're going to talk about policing decades later from where some origin of it might have been, and to say that there's still a thread of that, then we're going to have to apply that to every occupation and every cultural aspect of society that was going on prior to the Civil War. So let's talk about police reform. Let's talk about the state of policing in America today, but let's not talk about this being like the slave patrol prior to the Civil War. Simply not relevant, simply not driven by data and facts. Let's move on to some other topic and get away from this emotional claim that we're still operating as a slave patrol. Not happening, not true, not relevant to the debate.